Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today I've got a special guest. I've got Tom Dokken. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to be on. Thanks for the invite, Chris.
You know, Tom is joining us today on behalf of Sport Dog brand. And of course, Sport Dog is one of our great sponsors of the DU podcast. But before we get into some of the Sport Dog, some of the technical aspects of it and some of the training that you do, why don't you go ahead and explain to our audience, who you are, where you're located, just tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I've been a professional dog trainer for 45 years. Our kennel facility is in Northfield, Minnesota. If people are using training products, maybe they've seen our Dokken deadfall training products that we've come out with. And part of the Sport Dog senior staff and Purina as well. So we get a chance to go around the country, do a lot of seminars, and do a lot of education to people. People who are just starting off with their dog, or maybe people who are doing more finishing training as well. So it's kind of one of those jobs where you have to wear a lot of hats. But boy, if you're interested in the outdoors and dogs, it's the one to be in.
No, that's great. And before we do get into some of the Sport Dog conversation, I just want to touch base on the Dokken training tool. When did you actually come up with the deadfall trainer?
Well, they've been out for probably about 20 years now. And for people who don't maybe know what they are, we came out with a training dummy that looks and feels just like a real bird. But we designed the dummy so the dog could teach himself how to properly pick it up, how to carry it, and know that if they say like a dog comes and gets rough on a bird or wants to shake something, which is kind of that predator instinct, a lot of these dogs, if they go to shake it, the dummy actually will discipline the dog for making the mistake. So it came out as something that we just designed for our own personal use. And you only have to hear a few thousand times, where can I get one, before you go, well, maybe we need to get this on the market. So we've been fortunate that that product's been out, been very successful. And, it's just kind of one of those things that just seems to happen.
Yeah, I only ask because I personally have used those in the past with I've trained 3 dogs, and by no means am I a good dog trainer, probably more closer to mediocre. But I have used, the deadfall trainer with every single one of them. So I just wanted to get a little background on that and figure out when it actually did come out. So 20 plus years, that's amazing.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for using our product. Appreciate it.
So let's go ahead and transition into, Sport Dog, the e-training collars. They've got a ton of really cool, really innovative products that for dog trainers. And just to get started with this, so let's say you have a dog or someone comes to you and says, hey, I'm getting ready to start training a dog. What would be the first tool from Sport Dog that you would tell, this person, hey, you need to start out with this?
We kind of need to educate a little bit on when you would use a collar. So I'll back up just a little bit, that the remote collars are used as a reinforcement tool. They're designed to reinforce the commands that you've already taught to your dog. So really, first training tools would be basically a leash and probably a check cord, which, if somebody's got a dog, they're pretty standard equipment. So you're going to go through the teaching phase of teaching the dogs the commands and getting the dog to respond well to a leash. And then, a check cord, especially for young dogs. And I know that you've probably been through this like we all have, is you really feel that you don't have any control once they hit about 3 or 4 months. It's like, boy, what am I going to do? Then a check cord, for people who don't know, it's just a long leash. It's 30 to 50 feet long. And it gives you control in the early stages where, you've got to make a correction or give a tug on that leash so the dog understands. And then basically, once you get your dog, and I say get your dog really well versed in working with the leash on the basic commands. If you're talking a retriever, coming, sitting, staying, laying down, kenneling, any one of your basic commands, Get them so the dog understands, like if you tug on the leash or pull up on the leash, what they need to do in response to that command. And then when you introduce a collar, and everybody might be a little different, pros wise, when you're going to introduce a collar to a dog. I just kind of give a time frame of that 7 to 8 months of age is when I would start. And basically why I say that is, well, some people might go, well, geez, I had him doing all these things on a leash and he was 12 weeks old. Well, that's fine. But I want that puppy to have a little maturity to him. I want to have these commands just extremely solid. So when we make that transition, and then that transition would be on an extremely light setting on the collar. And I should say that with the Sport Dog brand collars, there's actually 21 levels of stimulus. And starting off on the lightest level, I always tell people if I had you put your fingers on the contact points and I had it on level 1 and I would say, I'm going to push the button now. And they would say, well, go ahead and push it. And then I said, well, I did it like 3 times. And the response would be, well, I didn't feel anything. And I go, I know you probably didn't feel anything. And they go, well, what good is that going to do me? When my dog's taken off. I said, that wouldn't do you any good. But the whole idea is you start at a very light level, and then you would gradually work up to where you see your dog acknowledge as you do your commands. And I would be using the leash and the remote collar at the same time. I'd be timing that correction with both of them. But really the first indication that you're going to see your dog even acknowledge it would probably be something like an ear twitch. They might blink, or they might just scratch their neck. And so what the whole beauty of this is, nowadays, these collars will match any temperament and personality. And I've been training for, like I say, 45 years. When remote collars first came on the market, it was one setting. And I'm telling you what, it was extremely hot. So as a professional trainer, there was a fraction of the dogs that could be trained with a remote collar because it was too much. And I always say that those were probably the toughest of the toughest dogs. And then most people would say, well, I think, my dog's tough. And I always go, no, most dogs are soft or medium temperament. They just don't respond to your command. So there's a big difference. Now with these variable intensities, the collar will actually match your dog versus having the dog have to match to the collar back in the old days. So that really, I'm getting into the training phase of this and is what I'm talking about right now. But we're going to then gradually use it to reinforce commands using the leash and the remote at the same time. And then basically what we do is we use the remote and then follow with the leash correction. So what we're trying to do is just wean our way off of the leash is all we're doing. And then from there, basically, you just want to consider that your remote collar is your leash. I just call it, it's an invisible leash because you don't have to be tethered to your dog. One other thing that I would also tell people is that before you'd even start remote collar, and I'll do this even with my young dogs, months before they'll be conditioned with remote collar, they're just going to wear the collar. I'm not going to use it, but I'll put it on them before we go out and do something fun. Basically, by the time we get to where we're actually going to start using the remote collar, you pull that collar out to put on the dog before you go do something. They come running up and jumping all over the place, wanting you to put it on. And they're thinking that this now is going to give me some freedom because we're going to go play. And then people say, well, why is that important that you do that? Here's why you go through that. The whole idea is that I don't want the dogs to know by the time they're all done with their remote collar training that they only listen when the collar is on them. So my dogs never associate a correction with me putting the collar on. And that's where you get a dog that goes like, boy, he listens really good when I have the remote collar on him. And as soon as I take it off, he doesn't listen. That's because they got collar wise. And that's, you just need to do the little, put it on them, do something fun, for several weeks ahead of time. And all of that goes away. So, when you talk about what's the first equipment, leash, check cord, and we want to condition the dog to just wearing the collar for a while, not hours a day, but when you go out, and then make that transition to actually starting the collar into your program.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into my next question, where I'm looking at Sport Dog Brand's website right now, and just looking at the various different models. Where would someone start? Is it all on a personal preference, or maybe it's the dog? But where does someone start to what would be the first collar that they would buy?
Let's say like a retriever. We'll take a retriever here, just for instance, to start with. What range do you need is probably the biggest thing at this point in time. So starting off, they have a 425X. 425X, rechargeable, waterproof. The big thing there is, once again, I said it has 21 different levels. So you can get that match. It also has tone and vibrate. We didn't talk about that. Tone and vibrate, once your dog is totally conditioned to the remote collar, you have the option of, and the collar itself, if you're on tone, when I press the tone button on the transmitter, it'll just emit a little doot, 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 little tone to the dog. He can hear it, but obviously at a distance you won't. Or it can be set to vibrate, that the collar actually vibrates, and this is without any correction. So my personal dogs, or the dogs that I work, we also upland hunt. So my dogs then are taught that when they hear the tone, I just want you to turn and check back in with me. So you're not having to whistle, yell, make a lot of noise when you're upland hunting either. So that's a feature. Now that 425, now that's going to be 500 yards range. So think about 500 yards. I mean, if you go like, when is my dog going to be 500 yards away from me? Now with a retriever, probably not that often. I mean, if at all, to be honest with you. If he is, he kind of maybe fell asleep.
Yeah, I got left behind or something. No, I think 500 yards would be pretty far for a waterfowl hunting dog. Now, an upland dog, maybe there was situations where that could be a little further, but I wouldn't see a whole lot of more than 500 yard range for sure.
Right, and then as you go up, and if people go to the website, you'll see all the various models. In a lot of cases, then the range will go up as well. Features will stay relatively the same, but then the range goes up. So the price goes up a little bit, not substantially really, but say like the 825X. Now that's 800 yards. Same levels of stim. It has vibrate, tone, waterproof, rechargeable. So for roughly right now about $20 more, you get 300 yards more of range.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say now those two, if you're talking retrievers, that in my opinion, now that covers a lot. And then plus you can expand those to 3 dog units too. So if you have multiple dogs, all you have to do is buy an add-on collar and you have a multi-dog unit. So that works there. And if you get into pointing dogs, obviously then you're going to want to start talking about, you're going to want to talk about range more than anything else. So, you get to the 1875, which is, an upland model, which has a beeper, for, getting your dog to the point where you understand where they're at. You're going to have a mile on that. Now, can you get units more than that? Sure. Pro Hunter, that goes up to 2 miles. So they really have something to cover everything. And then they also have their tracking units too. So, you have all of the advantages of your dog's out of sight. You're going to know exactly where they're at. Are they on point? Are they not? So really, this company, if you need it, they basically have something that you need no matter what you hunt and what kind of dog you have, which is pretty nice for us as a pro staff, is that, our customers have pretty much everything at their fingertips if they need it.
Regarding the containment system. So Sport Dog, I think it was last year or the year before, launched their fence, and it's a containment training system. It's compatible with all of the collars and kind of it just flows seamlessly. Can you kind of explain some scenarios where this comes in handy, or a time when maybe you use this product? But I've had a lot of people ask me about this containment system, and I've not personally used one, but I know that you could probably answer some of these questions.
Yeah, first I'll explain to people what a containment system is. So the one that we're talking about here is that It's all you're doing is burying a wire. You're going to make a perimeter where you want the dog to stay within. Okay, so and this particular unit that we're talking about right now, you could really fence in up to 100 acres. So wow. think about how much that is. So basically, a wire is just buried. I mean, just underneath the surface. I mean, this isn't deep. Really easy. And a lot of people are using these at their homes. We have a lot of customers that use them more for home containment, backyard, and so on. And you have that, but then you also have a transmitter that will go up to the 100 yards as well. That can go with that unit. So you could basically use it. It's, let's say, contain and train. So if you want a unit that you could have range of 100 yards, for some training, and then also have the in-ground fence. So you kind of have a little bit of the best of the both worlds. The range on the remote, we were talking earlier about how much range you'd need for dogs. It probably is going to give you less range, but in a lot of cases, even think about 100 yards for the average dog. I mean, at home in containment. One thing that I always like to say for containment, and we see this from a hunting standpoint and a training standpoint. If you are going to get a containment system, this is my personal opinion now, but you're also going to have your dog obedience trained and use a remote collar. What I like to say is do your obedience if you can first with the remote collar, because I'm going to point something out. Containment system basically has a boundary, an underground boundary, right? Dog gets to it, and as it gets to it, it learns, because you're going to place a lot of white flags on that containment. When they get there, when a correction comes, and obviously there's variable settings too, so you don't have to, have anything more than your dog needs. When your dog gets to that level, when it gets a correction, it's going to back up, right? It's not going to want to keep going into it. So the dog learns that when it gets a correction is to back away.
Yeah.
You with me?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say if a dog's been on a containment system, and it might come into training for us, and we're starting to work on coming when called, okay? Which is, everybody wants a dog that comes when called off leash. As we start working and do the remote collar work, let's say the dog is facing us, we give a tug on the leash, and we're doing the early conditioning to teach the dog when come when called. If the dog would be looking at us and it gets a correction on the collar, it may not want to move forward, right? Because if it moves forward with a correction, it's going into that field of correction if it had a fence.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? Why would I move into something if I've been taught to move away from it? So I always say, in a lot of cases, if you're going to use a remote collar for your obedience, do that first and then go into it. Can you train a dog out of that? Yes, you can. If you've done one before the other. I'm just saying it's easier, because a lot of times when a person checks a dog in nowadays for gun dog training or obedience training, we'll say, do you have in-ground fencing? And if they say yes, we know then that we'll have to do a little bit of deconditioning to teach that dog to move into it. So, but hey, what a great tool though. Just think of, the people, you're not going to put up a 6-foot fence in your backyard, most people, to keep your dog in. And a lot of cases, 4-foot fence for a sporting dog, I mean, that's just a hurdle more than anything else. So, an expense of putting in a fence versus having an in-ground, I mean, it's fantastic. The tools we have now, unbelievable. And we haven't even talked about bark collars.
Well, you got right into it. I mean, the massive amounts of tools. And that was one thing that I was going to ask you. I mean, you mentioned you've been training for 45 years. And I think it's kind of interesting for me anyway, and I'm sure our audience too, to hear how these tools have changed. You kind of mentioned when the first collars came out, and now you've got these various tools from Sport Dog that, like you said, it's everything that you possibly need, but you have seen that transition. And can you kind of speak to that? Just kind of talk about how that whole transition went from that beginning to now, where we've got these awesome tools.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I can remember, I mean, we didn't have, let's just say, the remote collar. We didn't have that. So I always tell people jokingly when I'm doing a seminar, when I'm talking about this subject, is I think us dog trainers back then weighed about 75 pounds because all day long you were chasing dogs. and I always say, by the time your dog is 3 months old, if they don't want to be caught, you're not going to catch them because you're not going to be fast enough. So the whole idea there, and it really was counterproductive. Just let's say a dog's out there, you're calling them, they're just ignoring you, won't pay attention, won't come, don't want to come into you. In old days, okay, you had to run out there. Well, there has to be some discipline for not, obeying my command. But what was happening, and if you think about this, if you go to your dog and then discipline it, they're going, all right, let's see. My problem is this guy.
Yeah.
So, and if he catches me, what's going to happen? I'm going to get disciplined. So, and really those dogs got to the point, if they would see you coming, they're going like, all I need to do is stay about 10 yards away from him, until he cools down or something. So now, because we have this equipment, the correction comes where where they're misbehaving. When they come back in, all I have to do is pet them and love them up and go, boy, what's going on out there? Hey, good to see you. You will see your dog over a period of time. And the beauty with these collars now is there's no lapse in when discipline needs to happen. So you really have a dog now that's starting to condition themselves to go, what? I hear the come. Let's just use come. I hear the come command, or here. I come in. Everybody loves me. So you actually are letting them make the decision. Just like we had to make decisions as kids. Well, I can stay out here. But the beauty is the correction comes where they're at. And now you're going to just see these dogs, and we have our customers say all the time, we normally get a dog when it's, it doesn't have all the control. And when we get the dog to the stage where we have the customers start coming out and we have them off leash, and we'll be talking, and they keep looking down at the dog going like, they can't believe that the dog just wants to just hang around. And they go, why isn't he just running off? Because he knows that this is the place, that this is just an easy place to be right here. And so this helps on obedience. 95%, I think, of these hunting dogs now, at least in our business, they're family dogs too. So they live in the house. So you got to let them outside.
Yeah.
All of those things, where back when I first started, that hunting dog lived out in the kennel. It was Dad's dog. That's his problem. But now these dogs have to, be under control, not just for Dad, but Mom. Mom's going to be taking care of them. And the collar now has taken all of the physical aspect out of training. And I always say, if your dog is on a number 3 setting on the remote, for me, and you have the remote, there's no difference in correction. So now that transition from person to person to person, that dog goes, well, I have to listen to everybody, because it's not physical discipline that the dog has to respond to. And most people, when they come to our place, they say, well, how come we never hear you guys yell? Mm-hmm. Well, you don't have to yell, really, because, you just talk to the dog, if the dog isn't responding to commands that they know well that they should, they get the amount of correction that's right for them. They go, okay. So what happens is you get a happy dog over a short period of time, because the dog isn't getting in trouble. You know what I mean? They're not constantly pressing every command. And as they keep doing it right, that turns into a habit. And those good habits get the praise constantly, or, you know what I mean, on a regular basis. So we don't have to tune up, let's say, like upland dogs, or, pheasant, or your grouse or quail. We're not tuning those dogs up like every year like we did back 40 years ago, because the owner now has the equipment that, and the biggest thing is control, right? For any dog, they have the equipment there. So in the past, they'd hunt them for a couple of weeks. Dogs starting to get out of control, have to bring them back in. We'd get them under control. And now that just doesn't happen. So, I mean, it's the tools now are fantastic. They just are. And you know what? Hunters don't have the anxiety that they had before either. They can actually go and have fun instead of fighting with the dog control-wise, especially upland bird hunting or in the duck blind breaking. It's just taken all the stress out of it, for the dog and the owner.
Sounds like it makes training in general, much easier than it was 45 years ago. But, it's putting that training, like you said, it's being able to put that training capability in the owner's hands as well during the off season. And I think that's a great thing for everybody to be able to be much more involved with it. One last question before we let you go here.
Mm-hmm.
We are, let's say we're middle of September here. We are, some duck seasons have started up a little further north of you. I know Minnesota's season is going to be opening here at late September.
Mm-hmm.
What stages of the training are you in right now, or what different tune-ups are you doing to get these dogs prepared for that opening day, that those first few hunts?
There's several things. Number one, a fair amount of the dogs aren't probably in good physical condition. I mean, hunting condition. They maybe haven't worked at home that hard. So number one would be get them physically in condition. That might up here, depending on your temperatures where you're at. Morning and evening would be a lot of land work where actually the weather's cool enough that you can start doing that. Afternoons for retrievers is definitely going to be in the water, so we can keep, working throughout the day. So conditioning is one thing. And then let's say retrievers, a dog that's had some training already is going to be steadiness in the duck blind, in the duck boat. It's one thing that, most dogs will slip on if the owners aren't keeping track of that, or maybe they're letting it slip. And, breaking goes from, when somebody shoots, I've seen dogs get to the point when they think you should shoot, they're jumping out of the boat, and then it just escalates. So that's not good. And then, upland wise, it's going to be number one, getting them in shape, and then getting that control, making them stay within the distance that works for you. A retriever, I want that retriever 20, 25 yards out in front. And I always say, if you get a straightaway bird that gets up and flushes straight away, by the time you react, that's probably 35 yards. Pointing dogs, obviously, you can let them go further because they're going to point and working them on holding point till you get up there. So bringing back, just tuning up any habits that, they had in the past that were there and maybe are broken. And then there's a lot of young dogs. A lot of people get a puppy in the spring. And so a lot of these young dogs now are going through their full formal training. And we're just getting them now within the next 6 weeks to the point where, okay, they're ready to go out on their first hunts, real hunts, and getting them ready to go into the season. So it's a mixture of a lot of different things right now.
Oh, that's great. No, those are some great little tune-up tips for people to think about, especially, I'm a big fan of the steadiness. I didn't do a very good job with that with my first dog. But after my first, I was about 17 years old when I had my first dog, but, every dog after that's been a major focus for me. And I think that's something definitely for our audience, those dog trainers out there, dog owners, to really think about steadiness, well before the season and even during the season. It's something you can work on.
I think those things start in the house though, too, to be honest, Chris. I mean, if you have your dog sit before you let them out the door, sit before they come in the door, put their food down, have them sit and wait till you tell them you can get it. You don't have to be out in the field doing a lot of the things that require some field work. But if you set some standards in the house, which you're around them every day, well, then it makes it easier to do the other stuff.
Yeah, and that just reinforces the command and that steadiness there. That's perfect, and that's a great idea. Well, Tom, this has been great. I appreciate you joining me on the podcast. I appreciate everything the Sport Dog brand's doing for supporting the podcast, and definitely all the great information that you've brought to the podcast. And we're definitely going to have you back on real soon.
Yeah, I look forward to it. I appreciate the opportunity, Chris.
All right. Thanks again, Tom.
You bet.
I'd like to thank Tom Dokken with Sport Dog brand for bringing some great information to the podcast, all about, some of their great products and also some of his training tips. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for doing a great job of putting this together. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining the DU podcast and for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.